Hi, and welcome back to Not Backpacking. My name's David, and today we're going to tackle the question of which flight search website is really the best. I've been booking my own flights online for the last 15 years or so, and I'm constantly getting asked which sites are the best for booking. I explored 6 of the most well-known flight search engines to see just how well they performed across a range of metrics. Even though I've been booking flights for 15 years online, I was still really surprised by some of the results I got. What I learned will definitely change the way I book flights in the future. There are 2 main things that matter when you're looking for the best flight search engine. The first of these is, does this site give me good prices? But second, is the site easy to use? I found that even some of the best or most well-known search engines don't give you the filters and options to help you find the best deal on the shortest routes. So let's start by looking at the worst of the 6 websites, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about how I evaluated them. The number 6 spot goes to Expedia. Now, I used to use Expedia a lot, but it just hasn't kept up with the improvements on flight search engines. Expedia had the second worst pricing of the 6 websites, but it also had a bunch of other weaknesses. Let's start with the positives though. The website is generally easy to use, and I do like the ribbon function that it brings up at the top of the screen when you're booking one-way or return trips that show you where you might find a cheaper flight a couple of days before or after. But Expedia handles stopover trips and open jaw trips really badly, and I'll explain more about those terms in a few minutes. Expedia gets you to select each leg of your trip individually. This means it doesn't adequately consider the flight duration for each leg of your trip. One of the test flights I used across all 6 websites was a flight from London to Tokyo, returning to London via Doha. Expedia really struggled to give me good results for this trip. If, for example, it found a cheap first leg on Turkish Airlines from London to Tokyo, it would then try to route you all the way back to London via Doha, consistently on Turkish Airlines. This meant it kept trying to make you do extra stopovers in Istanbul, so Tokyo to Istanbul to Doha, then Doha to Istanbul to London, and that became a very long trip very quickly. In fact, Expedia typically brought up trips that were 10 to 12 hours of travel time longer than what the other websites were bringing up for about the same price. Related to this point, Expedia has no option for you to choose the best flight, which many other websites do. And what this tries to do is balance how long the trip will take with cost. Expedia doesn't help you make this trade-off easily. It doesn't give you the information to do that well. Now, don't forget, if you're finding this video useful, please click like, please subscribe, and check out our other videos. There's many more coming that'll look at how to book the best flights. Now, you're going to want to stick around, especially to see how our top 2 websites perform. But before that, let me tell you a little bit more about what tests I performed to put these websites through their paces. I used 4 different flight searches across all 6 websites and did them all in a couple of hours so that I'd get comparable results across websites. The first search was a one-way trip from Paris to Istanbul, leaving in 3 weeks. The second test flight was a return trip from Houston, Texas to Madrid, Spain, leaving in 2 months' time and lasting for 1 week. The third test trip I've already talked about. It was the stopover trip where you depart London, fly to Tokyo, stop over in Doha on your way back to London. It was a trip leaving in 4 months' time and lasted 3 weeks. The final test flight was what we call an open jaw trip from Sydney through to Berlin, then overland and returning from Amsterdam back to Sydney. This booking was looking at 6 months out and a 3-week return trip. Now, I'm not a fan of budget airlines for a bunch of reasons that I discuss in another video, but one of these is that they typically aren't as budget friendly as they seem. So I kept the tests to full service airlines, except for the one-way trip from Paris to Istanbul. I tested how well the different websites cover budget airlines on that trip. Later in this video, I'll tell you how all 6 websites performed across the 4 test routes. But for now, let's look at our 5th ranked flight booking website. Number 5 is Kiwi.com. Now, Kiwi.com had the worst pricing overall. It came in last on 3 of the 4 routes I evaluated. Kiwi.com has one feature that I really do like, and I discussed in more detail in another video. But briefly, if you're happy to fly out of your destination from a different airport, it allows you to search for other airports up to 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles away from your destination so that you can see where there may be cheaper flights to get home. You could use that kind of function if, for example, you're flying into a particular destination for a family wedding, but then you wanted to go on and have a short road trip for a week or two locally and then fly out of a different airport. Another thing I like about Kiwi.com is that as soon as you start entering your departure or return dates, it will provide prices for dates around the ones you've selected. So you can see immediately if you might get a better price by shifting your departure or your return date by a day or two. Unfortunately, Kiwi.com has a bunch of weaknesses as well. One of these is that it doesn't allow you to filter flight options by the total duration of the trip. Like Expedia, this means you may find flights that are a little bit cheaper, but it does mean you'll be traveling for 10, 12, 15 hours more than you would by finding flights on another website for about the same price. But mostly because its pricing just wasn't very good, Kiwi.com was never going to make it to the top of the list. Now, before we hit number 4 on our list of the best ranked flight search engines, let's have a look how each of them performed on the one-way trip from Paris to Istanbul on a budget airline. As you can see, these flights were on a pretty narrow range, but Google came out on top. You'd save $15 each there compared to Kiwi.com. But getting back to our rankings, let's have a look at number 4, and that goes to Kayak.com. Now, Kayak actually did really well on price, coming in second overall, but it had a few weaknesses that I really want to talk about. One thing I find really annoying about Kayak is that they insist on showing you sponsored results first, rather than truly the best or the cheapest options that you're looking for. Presumably they're being paid even more to show you those sponsored results first, but it means that even when you click on show me the cheapest options, they're going to bring up a more expensive option first, and that's just cheeky. So going back to our test, how did the 6 websites do on the return trip from Houston, Texas to Madrid, Spain? Momondo did the worst here, coming out at $20 more than most of the other websites. So let's return to our ranking and the number 3 spot, which goes to Momondo. Momondo also had the 3rd best prices. Now, Momondo is actually owned by the same people who own Kayak, and so it shouldn't be a huge surprise that they come out with similar results. One thing I like about Momondo, and that is better than Kayak, is that it automatically gives you that price ribbon across the top of the screen that allows you to select cheaper flights a couple of days before or after the dates you've chosen. But annoyingly, just like Kayak, when you click on show me the cheapest options or show me the best options, it doesn't do that. It starts with sponsored results, and that's really misleading. For that, I have to mark it down. But getting back to our analysis of how the 6 websites performed across a bunch of different trip types, let's look at our stopover trip. So this was the trip from London to Tokyo with a stopover in Doha on the way back. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I almost gave up trying to find decent flights on Google and Expedia. They both performed really poorly here, digging out the best search results. But even on Google, if it wasn't for the fact that I had already been looking on other websites and had an idea of what I was looking for, I would not have dug out the best flights. With this possibly unfair advantage to Google, it did eventually manage to spit out a good price for me that was $80 cheaper. You need to stick around and see how much more money you could have saved by shopping around on the OpenJaw test trip. But first, who took the 2nd spot in our flight search engine analysis? This spot went to Google Flights. Now, it was tight between Google and the eventual winner, and if you look on the internet, you'll see tons of videos all telling you that you should be using Google Flights. Working through the tests that I did for this video have convinced me that it is worth checking out, and so I will be using it a lot more in future for our travel planning. One thing I really love about it is its Explore function that allows you to see a world map and show you flights to thousands of destinations very easily. But this pro is also a con because the website can actually overwhelm you with its map function that shows you so many possible options, it's really hard to narrow down to what you could be considering for your next holiday. Another thing that is great about Google is its price grid option. So once you've selected your departure and return dates, it'll then give you a price grid option that allows you to look at other combinations of origin and destination dates that will get you a better deal. But probably the coolest feature on Google is that you can set multiple cities as your potential origins, or even use an entire country as the area you're departing from. When might you use these functions? Well, again, imagine that scenario where you're flying into a particular destination for an event. It could be a business trip, it could be a family event. And afterwards, you've got a few days to kill and you want to travel somewhere. You're pretty open as to where you might travel to. Google's going to show you a bunch of different potential places you could fly out from for a decent price. And then, of course, Google did come out the best overall on flight prices. So with all these things that I've talked about that are so positive, why do I still rank it number 2? Well, firstly, it's a far less intuitive and attractive website to use. Functional would be a kind way to describe it. User unfriendly would be a blunter way to describe it. For example, using filters to eliminate airlines I didn't want to include in the search process was really painful. The filter function seemed to be fighting against me to try and only allow me to deselect one airline at a time. Really slow. Second, and a major negative for me, is that Google does not allow you to set a maximum total trip duration. Now, it allows you to set trip duration limits for each leg of your trip, but that doesn't help you find the best combination of price and shortest trip duration the way other websites do. It's more along the lines of Expedia or Kiwi.com, and I do not like that. But let's turn back to our test flight analysis for a second. What about the final test that we ran? Remember, this was an open-jaw trip, departing from Sydney, Australia, flying through to Berlin in Germany, and then returning to Sydney from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Expedia was around $370 more than Google. But Kiwi.com was even worse, at more than $400 more than the Google search results. So who won our flight search engine evaluation? The number 1 spot goes to Skyscanner. Now, I have to say that I think the gap has narrowed remarkably between Google Flights and Skyscanner, and so I recommend you at very least use both these websites to try and find the best deal. I've been using Skyscanner as my main search engine for the last 5 or 6 years, but I reckon if Google can work through some of its presentation and filtering issues, it's going to be very hard to beat. So where does Skyscanner do well and where does it do badly? Well, it wasn't the cheapest website. That said, it did have the best prices on the Houston to Madrid return trip and on the stopover trip from London to Tokyo and back again via Doha. It has a very intuitive website interface that's much easier to use than Google's. As I've pointed out many times, I love that it allows you to set the maximum trip duration so you can knock out all those absurdly routed trips that will take forever. Skyscanner's best versus cheapest options search functions generally work really well, although I always double check to make sure they get the right trade-off between price and trip duration. Another feature I love about Skyscanner is its Travel Anywhere function, where it will simply give you a list of options of where you could travel to, starting from the cheapest, depending on the travel time that you've selected. While the map function on Google looks way cooler, the sheer number of options it gives you and the way it's presented makes it very hard to narrow down to what could be realistic travel options for you. One weakness on Skyscanner that it needs to overcome and should be able to do quite easily because so many other websites do this is to allow you to enter multiple origins to depart from. This is exactly what we're planning to do on our upcoming trip to Europe, and it would have come in really handy if Skyscanner was better able to handle those kinds of searches. So, our analysis of 6 of the most well-known flight search engines suggests that Google and Skyscanner are your best options for planning that next trip. These are certainly the 2 search engines we'll be using the most over the next little while. Before we say goodbye, I'd love it if you could click like, and it would be great if you could subscribe so we can keep you up to date with all our newest videos as they come out. We'll be doing a lot more on flights over the next few weeks. Some of the things we're going to be looking at include the best strategies to find flights depending on your circumstances and the kind of trip you're taking. I'll also be doing another video on round the world trips. Let's chat again soon. Take care.